Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, and I'm a professor here in the Environmental Studies Department at Dartmouth. And I'm really excited today, as part of our new energy series, to welcome Paige Weber. Paige is an assistant professor at UNC. But right now, she's in Santa Barbara. We were just sharing some stories before she came. And we're really excited to hear her talk today on equity impacts of markets for clean air. I think California is a really interesting place to study this, with the EJ movement getting a start there. And so I'm going to turn it over to Paige. We'll listen to her speak, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And I look forward to the conversation we're going to have. Paige, thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to your talk and then the conversation to follow.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for inviting me to participate in this seminar series. As Elizabeth said, I'm Paige Weber, currently an assistant professor at UNC Chapel Hill. But right now I'm on a research leave at UCSB. So I've been able to work with my co-author on this project, Olivier Deschênes, very closely over the last couple months. So today I'm going to talk about our project, which looks at the equity impacts of two predominant markets for clean air. Oh, sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Oh, I think there is a slide that's missing on motivation. So I'm going to speak to that. So I saw that Danae Hernandez-Cortez was in the last seminar series. So for those of you that attended that talk, you're well versed in the motivation for this project. So we've seen clear evidence and a burgeoning amount of literature documenting the disparities in environmental hazards, in exposure to environmental hazards along income and race. That literature has really grown in the last decade. And actually, Danae and I are working on, with some other co-authors, on a literature review that summarizes some of that research. Now, among that research, there is a subset of the literature that is looking at how regulations play a role in this disproportionate exposure. And the term environmental justice gap, which you may have been familiar with or learned about last week, refers to this gap in pollution exposure. So within this group of literature that's studying how regulations impact the environmental justice gap, there's been a particular attention around the role of market-based policy. And so there's been an ongoing question, which I think you may have even picked up and you see, discussed in newspapers or headlines about environmental policy, around whether market-based mechanisms have a role in future environmental policy. And that question surrounds their impact on the environmental justice gap and what their equity impacts are. So in this project, there's been, a growing set of literatures asking that question: how does market-based policy impact the environmental justice gap? And I think so far it's fair to say the answer is mixed. And so this project is going to weigh in on that question, and we're going to do it in a way that we're going to be particularly focused on trying to identify the mechanisms in which this market-based policy would expect it to increase or decrease that environmental justice gap. Okay, so as I said, there's this growing literature. Here are some of the citations that you may be interested in. If you're looking for more work documenting the environmental justice gap across different pollutants and different settings. And as I said, we have this forthcoming literature review that hopefully sort of summarizes what's been done in the last decade. And among that literature, there's a particular emphasis on regulations, and we're going to be weighing in on this question about market-based policy. Okay, so before we jump into what we do in this project, I want to take a step back and think about how could markets impact who benefits from air quality regulations. So what are the key high-level mechanisms that would mean a market would impact equity outcomes, and especially if we're thinking about, say, comparing a market to another policy mechanism. So the key thing about the market is it's going to allow the firms with the lower abatement costs to do more of the work. So this means firms that can reduce whatever the regulated pollutant is, whether it be GHGs or NOx or SO2, firms that can reduce that pollutant at lower cost are going to be doing more of their work. They're going to be doing more of the production. So then the key question is, really, what is the relationship between those firms that are going to be doing more of the work under the market, so those firms, the lower abatement costs, and the downstream communities that would impact from the reduction of emissions at those firms. And so that's really an empirical question and one that we're going to study here. So just some other notes about comparing environmental policy implemented with a market-based mechanism versus, say, another non-market regulation like a command and control thing is the difference is really going to depend on abatement cost heterogeneity. And what I mean by that is the markets are going to look a lot different than a command and control regulation if the costs of reducing emissions vary a lot across firms that are being regulated, right? And that gets to that, the second bullet point too. And then what you really need to pay attention to is how those costs vary and the spatial distribution of where those firms are located. Now, two other things to keep in mind when thinking about markets versus non-market policy would be the presence of co-pollutants, so pollutants that are also emitted alongside the pollutant that are being regulated, and then the presence of offset provisions. And these two things are more important to pay attention to if we're studying a climate change policy, which is done, in other literature. In this case, we're going to be studying two markets that regulate a local air pollutant, so we don't have to think about offsets as much. And then, of course, the cost of the policy. We're not going to think about cost of the policy here, but that's, of course, an important area of inquiry for future research. Okay, so as I said, we're going to ask who benefits from two predominant markets for clean air. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the NOx budget program, the NPB, and the Clean Air Interstate Rule. And the first step is to estimate the plant level emissions effects of these two markets. Next, we're going to try to understand where these emissions reductions are coming from. And we're going to decompose the emissions effects in terms of changes in production at the power plants regulated by these programs versus changes in emissions and emissions intensities. So next, we're going to say, as I said, a key part of the market is it allows certain firms to do more of the work depending on their abatement costs. And so we're going to estimate or investigate the presence of differential effects, differential responses to the policy by plant fuel and age. Then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to use our estimates of the effects of the policy on the plant level emissions and map them to downstream human health benefits. And we're going to do this using an integrated assessment model called AP3, which some of you may have heard of, and we'll talk a little bit about more later. Okay, so the regulations we're studying. So the NOx budget program implemented a cap and trade program on NOx in 19 states, started in 2003. It goes through 2008. It regulated around 2,500 fossil fuel point sources, mostly electric generating units. The key thing about this program is it's actually a seasonal regulation, so it's only in effect 5 months of the year, in the period in which ozone is expected to have the most severe human health effects. So it's in effect from May and September. Then in 2009, the Clean Air Interstate Rule added 9 states to the coverage from the NOx budget program, and it also added an annual NOx emissions cap in 2009. And in 2010, it added an annual SO2 emissions cap. So we're going to be studying both of these programs. Okay, so the data we're going to use for this project, a lot of it comes from the EPA Clean Air Markets Division. We're going to use their SEMS data, which you may have been familiar with if you've worked on electricity plant data. It provides these SEMS data comes from continuous emissions monitoring systems installed at the plants. It gives us hourly production, hourly fuel, hourly NOx and SO2 emissions. And then we complement this data with some facility data also available from the EPA. Then we're going to match power plants to their local and also their downstream community demographics using decadal census data. And then finally, to connect our estimates of emissions effect from the program to downstream impacts on human health, we're going to use estimates from the AP3, formerly known as AP2 or APEEP model, which is an integrated assessment model that links emissions of air pollution to their exposures, physical effects, and monetizes the damages by county. And the key thing about this model is it embeds a pollution transport model. So it allows us to think about a unit of emissions at one plant. It allows us to think about all the downstream counties that are impacted by that pollution. Okay, so the first empirical approach is to estimate these emissions effects of the program. And so to do that, we're going to use a difference in differences approach to estimate the monthly emissions effects at the plant level of the seasonal NOx budget program and also the annual CARE. Then we're going to compare these changes in terms of changes in emissions versus changes in plant level production or load. And then we're going to investigate the presence of heterogeneous effects by power plant characteristics. Okay, so to review our empirical strategy in a picture, so here what we've done, I've plotted the county level NOx emissions over time. And here is 2003, where the NPB, the seasonal program began. And here is 2009, where the first part of the annual program for NOx began. And then in 2010, the annual SO2 program began. And so the blue is regulated county and the green is non-regulated county. And so if you look at this period where just the NOx budget program was in effect, you can see that during these summer months, you see this pretty dramatic drop and then back to return to in the winter months, we see this drop in NOx emissions in the summer months. And so that's what we're going to be trying to precisely estimate with our empirical strategy. Then when we get to the annual program, we see that the regulated counties now have a persistent reduction in NOx emissions. So we're not seeing this seasonal pattern anymore below the non-regulated counties. However, you will also note that in order to do differences analysis and attribute the effect that you find causally, you need consistent pre-trends. And we'll see that these regulated counties look like they're on a sharper NOx reduction trajectory than the non-regulated counties. And so we're still investigating what's driving these pre-trend and doing a number of tests. But for now, because we can't rule out that the regulated counties were that this reduction here came from a more dramatic reduction in NOx emissions in the pre-period, that's going to inform how we interpret the results that we find. So we'll get back to this later. But the nice thing about the seasonal program is because it's seasonal, we can include a county by year fixed effect, which we'll talk a little bit about later, which allows us to attribute a causal interpretation of our results. So this is sort of the estimation strategy in a picture. Okay, so the estimation in equation, we're going to put plant level emissions on the left-hand side, monthly level emissions, and we're going to regress that on a treatment indicator for whether the plant is in a NOx budget program state after the program has started. And then in the second specification, we're going to interact that treatment variable with an indicator for the technology of the power plant. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we're going to vary the left-hand side variable to also include monthly generation on this side, because we want to see if any emissions reductions that we find are coming from a change in production at the plant, or if they're not, we can say that they're coming from a change in plant level emissions intensity. And that's because emissions are the product of production times emissions per production. So if production is not changing, we can say that the emissions are changing through a change in emissions intensity. Okay, so what do we find? So in the first column here, I have load, and then we have NOx and SO2, and I'm presenting the results for the seasonal program and the annual program. So we see in terms of load, is our variable for production. So you can think of load as synonymous with power plant production. We're not precisely identifying an effect of the policy on power plant production. We are, however, precisely identifying effects of the seasonal and the annual program on monthly plant level NOx emissions. This third column leverages the seasonality of the program to, as I said before, in this specification, we're including a county by year trend, which is we're controlling for any pre-treatment trends at the county year level. And we find an even larger reduction on monthly plant level emissions from the seasonal program during the months in which the program is in effect. In terms of SO2, so the seasonal program is just a program on NOx, but we were curious to see if it had an effect on SO2, because you might expect that there's a set of abatement options or abatement technologies that would lead to reductions in both NOx and SO2. For example, if the plant was switching from coal to gas, we would see a reduction in both. But we're not seeing any evidence of any spillover on SO2 from the seasonal NOx budget program. The annual program, which included a cap and trade program for SO2 in 2010, does have a large effect on SO2 emissions. And so what I'm doing here is I've collapsed as I said before, the annual programs that happened through CAR were a NOx cap and trade program in 2009 and a SO2 program in 2010. For simplicity, we've played around with a lot of ways of presenting the results. I've collapsed the result into just, I'm thinking about the regulation as just one annual program. And so when I do that, I'm not including the year 2009 from our sample, because you can think of this as sort of the ramp up period where only the NOx annual program was in place and the SO2 wasn't yet. So that's why I sort of have this one regulation variable here, but welcome thoughts on other ways to display the results. Okay, so getting to the biofuel type results. So here what we do is we interact the regulation with an indicator for what technology the plant is. And so I'm starting off with the same dependent variables, and these are the results for just the coal plants. And so we see negative coefficients on load, but we don't estimate anything precisely. So we can't precisely say that the coal plants are changing their production as a response to the policy. We see much larger coefficients on monthly NOx emissions. So what this tells us is that the results that we saw above are really stemming from a reduction in emissions at the coal plants. Similarly, with SO2, we see no effect on the coal plants in the seasonal NOx budget program, but we do see a large effect once the annual program is in effect, the annual SO2 program. Now, moving to gas plants. So on gas plants for the annual program, we see some evidence that gas plants are actually increasing production following the program. And this matches our intuition about how the market would work. So we can think about gas plants in this market as essentially lower abatement cost firms. So we might expect production to move towards those lower abatement cost firms, and that's what we do see. So the gas plants are increasing in production in the annual program, and as a result, their emissions are also increased in NOx and SO2. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the mixed plants. These are the plants that from the SEMS data, we can't identify as whether they're all coal or all gas, because within each power plant, the units have a mix of gas and coal, but the mixed plants appear to be reducing emissions in the program. Okay, so the takeaway from this slide is all of the work in reducing emissions in this program is happening from the coal plants. And it appears to be happening not by, well, we don't precisely find an effect of production. So we conclude that some of this must be happening through emissions intensity improvements at these coal plants. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is, okay, so another feature of this market, as we said, is that, if there's a lot of heterogeneity in abatement costs, you would expect plants to be doing more of the reduction along those dimensions of heterogeneity. So some other potential plant characteristics that could lead to different abatement costs would be plant age, efficiency, and size. So what we do is we study the effect of the regulation along those different dimensions of plant heterogeneity. What we find, and I don't have these null results here, is that, I'll say what we don't find is we don't precisely identify any clear heterogeneous treatment responses along the dimensions of plant efficiency nor size. But I will say we're looking for another variable to measure plant size. Right now, we just approximate size based on the total annual production of the plant. But we do find evidence of heterogeneous responses along this age dimension. So here, what I've plotted for coal plants is the seasonal and annual estimates for old and young plants. And what we're seeing is evidence that the younger plants are doing more of the emissions reductions compared to the older plants. And this is consistent with a story where you might think if you're an older coal plant, you're becoming maybe a stranded asset in some cases. Maybe the plant manager is less willing to make an upfront costly investment when they know, say, they're going to retire the coal plant in a couple of years, versus a younger coal plant, maybe just been built. Then it's more worth it for the plant manager to make that costly investment to reduce emissions and lower their compliance costs with these policies. So takeaway here is that the key dimension of heterogeneity we're finding is along plant age, but we're going to be continuing to investigate some of these other plant characteristics. Okay, So that's empirical approach part one, which is to understand how these programs are impacting monthly emissions at the plant level. Now, the next approach is to map those emissions changes to their benefits from avoided pollution in receptor counties. And so I'll say receptor or downstream counties. What I mean by this is these are the counties that are the recipients of the pollution at these plants. And so to make this connection, we're going to leverage this AP3 integrated assessment model, which allows us to connect for an additional unit of pollution at a given power plant in a given location, which counties would receive that pollution. And conversely, in this case, which counties are now not receiving that pollution because of the regulation. So we're going to do that analysis and come up with some estimates of the monetized human health benefits of the program. And then we're going to review how those damages, we're going to do some distributional analysis based on the county demographics of the counties that are seeing those benefits. Okay. All right, so just to kind of give us some intuition around how this AP3 model is working. So for an illustrative power plant in Orange County, North Carolina, you can see the pollution dispersion is quite vast. So what the AP3 model is it uses a pollution transport model to think about where the pollution goes when it was emitted from that power plant, and then it complements that with dose response functions, which then monetize the human health damages from the pollution in the other counties. So the full picture of the damages of pollution from this power plant in North Carolina is the sum of all those damages in all the counties that the NOx travels to. Okay, all right, so what happens when we use the AP3 model to come up with some summary statistics around the benefits of these programs? So what I've done here is presenting some numbers for the annual regulation and the seasonal regulation, and I've broken them up by counties in regulated states versus not, because I think it provides sort of an interesting note here that because pollution moves, counties in non-regulated states also see some damages avoided. They also see some benefits from this program. And because of the caveat about the annual regulation, so I mentioned that with the annual regulation, we can't rule out that pre-trends are contributing to these estimates that we get. You should think of these numbers as, here are the NOx benefits that occur in these regions over this period, which may be partially contributed to by the regulation, but for now we can think of it as these are benefits that accrued over this period. So we see in the regulated counties in the annual NOx program that's $17 billion in NOx benefits per year during the program, and $236 billion from SO2 benefits. The large share of that is occurring in regulated states, but we do see some occurring in non-regulated states. The seasonal regulation, which we feel more confident that we can provide a causal interpretation of these benefits, as in the regulation did induce these benefits, we see around $7 billion in NOx benefits from the seasonal regulation annually. And some of that, $185 million, is occurring in counties in non-regulated states. So we're able to document some evidence of the regulation spillover effects on non-regulated counties. Okay, so another dimension of looking at how these benefits accrue is what we're doing here is I want to think about the benefits that occur in the county of the pollution source versus the benefits that occur in all the counties that the pollution travels to. And the point here is to really help us think about which demographics we need to be keeping track of when we're wanting to do distributional analysis of this policy. So if we were to just think about the benefits that just occur in the county where the power plant is located, we'd see that the program has around 177 million in NOx benefits from the annual program. And most of these benefits, 17 of the remaining benefits, are occurring outside of the pollution sources county. And so this gives you a sense of this is driven by the fact that pollution travels. And so it gives you a sense that to keep track of the benefits of this policy, you really need to be thinking about where pollution is moving to. And with the seasonal regulation, we see a similar pattern. Around 228 million of the NOx benefits are occurring just in the county where the power plant is located, and the vast majority are occurring outside of that county. Okay, So now let's connect these benefits to the county demographics. And so what I've done here is we're just associating the seasonal regulation benefits with the county demographics where they occur. And I've shown it in two ways because the graph will help us a little bit with some of the interpretation. But here I've just regressing the benefits on county demographics, no causal analysis, just purely descriptively. We want to understand what are the local demographics where in the counties that are seeing these benefits. So population is on the top row because of the way the model works. If there's more population in the county, you're going to see more damages and thus more damages avoided from the regulation. So population is always positively correlated with benefits. And we see that the benefits are also positively correlated with the share of the county population that's non-white. And then we see in this purely regression sense that the NOx benefits are actually negatively correlated with the share of the population that's in poverty. So what this is showing is that we see benefits are increasing in share non-white and actually decreasing in percent poverty. But let's use these graphs to dig into that a little bit. So in this panel, in this left-hand panel, I've plotted the benefits from the seasonal regulation and the annual regulation using a bin scatter approach. And we see that we do see a positive and increasing trend where we're seeing more of these benefits in counties with a larger share of their population non-white. The percent poverty story is a little more nuanced because we see in these lower, here we see a positive relationship where benefits are first increasing in share of the population that's in poverty and then decreasing. So the story with county poverty is a little more nuanced where we see trend breaks around different levels of poverty. And I'll note here that, of course, this masks within county heterogeneity in percent poverty and share non-white. And we're limited in some ways by our use of the AP3 model, which is at a county level basis. So that model is great because it allows us to see where pollution goes, but it means we have to talk in terms of county level demographics, which of course has its limitations. Okay, so where do those benefits just come from? So I think maybe you've gotten this from sort of the beginning of the talk, but what drives those associations is really where pollution is traveling to, right? From the plants that the regulation induces reduction. So the regulation isn't, so basically the inverse of that is we could investigate the inverse of that through the AP3's damages and receptor county demographics. So what I mean by that, if you wanted to predict who's going to benefit from the regulation, you want to understand who's living downstream of the plants that are going to reduce emissions following the regulation. And so these correlations are just to confirm that the mechanism of really the last slide is really coming from who's being downstream of these power plants and their local community demographics. And we see that the signs of the coefficient are the same as we saw in the last slide. So that the counties that are seeing more of the NOx damages overall have a larger share of non-white. And actually we see this negative relationship with percent poverty, which is counterintuitive if you would expect counties to fully capitalize the fact that they are downstream of pollution. But as I showed you in the last slide, we did see this trend break in the relationship between NOx damages and share of the county in poverty. Okay, so it looks like I'm at 9:30, so I'm gonna conclude. Oh, I had one other slide. So I wanted to note that we found this relationship based on the total distribution of the pollution using this pollution transport model. If you were to just look at the relationship between coal and gas capacity and their local community demographics, you get a very different story. So I just want to highlight the importance of thinking about pollution transport because otherwise you'd get, in fact, the opposite results. So to show you that, here what I've plotted is coal capacity. So this isn't just count of power plants, coal and gas capacity. It's not just count, but actually the total megawatt capacity of power plants by those same community demographics. So what we see is that coal capacity is decreasing in share non-white. So that's right, sort of the opposite relationship that we saw when we thought about the damages from power plants in the last slide. And then we see actually the coal capacity is lower among higher income counties on average. And with natural gas, we actually see a different relationship. And this is important because we saw two different types of responses from these two different types of power plants. With natural gas, we see that gas capacity is increasing in share non-white and also increasing in median income. So the point of these descriptive results is just to show you the importance of thinking, to show you that there's a difference in the community demographics where these pollution sources are located and the community demographics that receive the pollution from these pollution sources. Okay, so some takeaways. For the seasonal regulation, we find estimates that we can interpret causally, that it leads to around 7 billion in health benefits per year from avoided damages. The reductions we find are coming from coal plants, and in particular, they're coming from younger coal plants. And we find evidence that they're coming from plant level improvements in emissions intensities because we don't see clear evidence that these plants are changing production levels. We see the reduction leads to benefits that are increasing in average county population share non-white and decreasing in percent poverty with that trend break that we noted before. And what we find overall in this project, that the distribution of benefits really is driven by the spatial location of coal plants and wind patterns. And so just to leave on a final note, what we're arguing in this project is that really the key here is in predicting, the key to understanding where these benefits, which communities are going to see the benefits of these regulations, is really to understand where the power plants are located and where the pollution is traveling to from the power plants that are reducing emissions following these regulations. So thank you, I'll leave it at that.
I'm coming back on. I'm going to unpin you. We had you highlighted here. Thank you so much, Paige, for that wonderful talk. I really appreciate the perspective of thinking about, okay, wait a second, here I am, I'm here. Really thinking about this regulation from an econometric perspective. I've asked all of the participants to please put your questions in the Q&A box. I know Aaron Mansour, you're here, and I also saw that we had a few other economists in the room, and so I'm counting on you guys to ask the specific model ones. Aaron, do you want to type it into the box? Let me just let you talk, Aaron, since you're going to have some model specific questions. Okay, go for it.
Thanks. Yeah, I rather not type just because I'm lazy, but Paige, thanks a lot for presenting that. So I appreciate it. One question I had was with regards to care. So the SO2 market has a long history of versions of regulation, and care as part of that messy transition across states and times and different programs. And what that resulted in was some prices that collapsed, as you know. So I guess what I struggle with is in thinking about how do we attribute any changes at power plants in 2010 to cap and trade in a system where the prices have collapsed so much that there's excess capacity.
Aaron, are you talking about the prices collapsing because of the natural gas coming into the market?
Yeah, there's several reasons. So one of it is anticipation of cap and trade. Yep. And so if we, there's a long history of these regulations being held up in court and then being allowed to go forward, and then new regulations going in. So it's just hard to exactly model what the firms were expecting. In the end, it ended up having a price of basically zero. So it's hard for me anyway to attribute that necessarily to trade. It's the threat of trade, perhaps. But that's one thing. And then as you raised, another issues that are going on were that natural gas prices were collapsing. Wholesale demand was lower than anticipated. So coal plants were reducing output substantially across the board. And of course, this is where the diff and diff comes in. But I was wondering how much we can attribute necessarily to cap and trade as opposed to kind of this mishmash of everything that was kind of going on.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's why I was saying being pretty careful with the annual versus the seasonal interpretation. So I think with the annual program, we can't rule out that those emissions reductions came from that pre-trend that we saw. And it may be that, the emissions reductions that we're estimating here, which, we're estimating them to occur, but we're being careful about not saying it was causally associated with the cap and trade program, may have just been an extension of that pre-trend. And so I think that's sort of an argument that we'd like to continue to firm up here. But that's a great, so that's a great point. Emissions reductions occurred, and I think we're still working on trying to decompose what was just an extension of what we saw in that pre-period. Does that speak to your question?
I would say it's probably not only the pre-period, but the real shift in context as that cheap frac natural gas came online, and you had all of those dispatch orders shift in the electricity market. It was it was almost a discontinuity when we started getting all that natural gas on and really seeing huge shifts in the electricity market.
Right.
Yeah, and what we when we plotted to entry and exits in this market, you can clearly see at the natural gas entry is taking over the coal exit in this market. Alluding to what you're accompanying with the change in natural gas prices. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say one thought I had on this front was Josh Lynn and co-authors have a paper in RAND a couple of years ago that kind of goes through why coal plants were producing less and retiring. And I think taking that kind of approach or some of his results as additional controls might be an interesting way of trying to address kind of the market forces and try to tease that out from the cap and trade portion of it.
Thank you so much, Aaron. We'll bring you back in a little bit. I have two other questions. Thanks again for that. I really appreciate that. Amanda Graham asks, thank you. You show the total amount of benefit accruing to the home county versus outside counties, but how do the averages compare? That is, are the home counties accruing more or less benefit financially than outside counties on average?
I think the results that I was showing you could interpret as averages across all. I think I may not have presented the average result, but yeah. So on I guess I'm rephrasing her question. Maybe she's wondering, I had the sum of the total damages in the home counties, but yeah, how did the average?
Is that slide 12? No, that was another slide. Okay, that was
let's see. Okay, yeah. So basically, break this out into averages. That's a good point. I should do that, and then I'll speak to that. I mean, I think in terms of the levels here, you would expect that the averages in the home county are also much smaller, but that's a good point. I should definitely include that here.
And then Amanda also asks, you note that this type of regulation is having a greater impact on lower abatement cost facilities. Could you comment on whether you could envision market-based policies that could more effectively target higher polluting, higher abatement cost facilities?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, one way to let's say you had a market that was targeting certain low abatement cost firms, but those firms maybe led to smaller marginal damages versus other firms that maybe had higher abatement costs, but if you reduced a unit of emissions in that firm because of its location, it maybe led to higher marginal damages. One way to internalize that would be to have spatially distinct permit prices. And this is, I think, hypothesized or discussed in, I think it's a Mendelson and Mueller paper that I don't, forgetting the exact year, but the idea there would be is that these pollution damages these emissions lead to different damages in different locations. So the way to sort of perfectly address that would be a pollution price that varied highly across space. That would be in practice hard to implement, but someone can dream. What were you saying?
That's going to be a fun one to negotiate politically. You can just imagine that one.
Yeah. The other challenge too is then you'd probably need to continue to you couldn't just set those spatially specific prices and leave them. You'd have to update them dynamically.
No, I mean, it's really interesting to think about the perfect solution that really would provide that versus the others. A question from Anson Doc. Air and people know no boundaries. Have you considered using metropolitan/urbanized area boundaries, commuting patterns, please advise. And I know we saw some other work that was done at a more county level that was looking at the air pollution impacts of different communities. But if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of that question as maybe getting at the difference between pollution where people live and work. Maybe you can repeat. I think you're thinking about people moving across space.
Yeah, Aaron, people know no boundaries using metropolitan or urbanized area boundaries and commuting patterns. Please advise.
Yeah, so one thing I thought about in another, with respect to, say, I don't know, electric vehicles or other ways of getting at where people are being exposed. So exposure may differ depending on occupation. So we know that people that have maybe work outside are more likely to be exposed, and it differs depending on where you live and where you work. And so I know on the please advise, I know that the census loads data I've looked at for another project has estimates of average commuting patterns from census tract to census tract. And I think that is going to be an important dimension to thinking about where people are actually being exposed. And I was thinking about this in the context of, say, electric vehicles, because you want to think about where people are driving. So, I mean, I guess another thing is that what hopefully we'll be able to do in this literature is because people, are say moving, commuting to work, and pollution exposure differs, dramatically within the county. Hopefully, we'll see more and more granular emissions monitoring. So maybe you could use something like Purple Air or other crowdsourced air monitoring equipment to more precisely understand the pollution exposure that people are facing at home and where they work.
No, that's really interesting. Right before this talk, I'd mentioned that I'd also lived in North Carolina. What I forgot to mention was that I was working at EPA's Office of Research and Development with a group that was building the AP3 model. And so when I was hearing, I'm like, oh, this is just fantastic that you're kind of using it in these different kinds of ways. And I know with the CARE legislation, it really was targeted at coal plants. And when, as Aaron said, we looked at all of the things affecting coal, we of course know it's different. But I think one of the real stories now, and I'd just like you to comment and reflect a little bit on it, we're talking about dramatically reducing greenhouse gas emissions and associated pollutants. How could tools like yours be used in that conversation?
Oh, so sort of trying to connect, I guess, this research with what it means for greenhouse gas policies
in the dramatic greenhouse gas emissions kind of sought after by the current administration.
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat that last part?
I just said, we have big goals. We have a need to get there relatively rapidly. How could the types of tools that you're using be useful for helping us step and measure and monitor the equity impacts going forward?
Yeah. So I'll say, one nice thing about, I think motivating greenhouse gas policy with its impact on local air pollutants is like, you'd expect voters to care. Rationally, you'd expect voters to maybe care more about local air pollution than global climate change. So I think connecting climate change policy with its local impacts, so connecting greenhouse gas emissions with their co-pollutants, is a potentially powerful political tool to galvanize support for climate change policy. Because otherwise it's like, how am I going to see the benefits from this, but my energy prices are going to go up. In terms of connecting the tools, I think one thing that I think is I think there's some sort of test that you can do to think about for a given, say, market-based policy to address greenhouse gases or local air pollutants, how much reallocation of pollution would we expect and in what direction? And so there's a couple, I think, maybe depending on the industry, like basic tests that you could do. So for a given industry that you're regulating, do we expect a large variety or a large spread in their abatement costs? If the answer is no, then we wouldn't expect much redistribution of pollution from the market-based policy, right? Much redistribution of production. And so that kind of helps us with some bounding questions. So if you're concerned that, from this market-based policy, we're going to be pushing pollution to certain power plants or certain industries or not, the first sort of test is, okay, well, how much cost heterogeneity do we expect in this industry? Then the second is, okay, are there any of those dimensions of cost heterogeneity that I expect to be systematically related with the communities that are seeing that pollution? And that, you need maybe some economics to help you understand. But that's really, I think, the key question to ask. And I think a lot of tools in economics are maybe potentially well suited to answer those. So in the case of age, for example, or fuel type, we may be able to identify some systematic patterns between characteristics that we expect would drive how a firm would respond to this environmental or market-based policy. And then we want to see if those characteristics are systematically located upstream of certain communities.
Thank you very much for that. It's good just to think about big picture and how we're going to be seeing this type of conversation go forward. Amanda Graham asks, to return to one of your original premises, that the evidence on how market-based policies affect environmental energy justice is mixed. It seems as though your study confirms that. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that in this case, so we don't find evidence of like a clear systematic relationship between where these benefits are occurring and the downstream demographics. We see the positive relationship with share non-white, but maybe this trend, this negative relationship with percent poverty. But in this study, we're saying that that's driven by the spatial pattern of pollution dispersal. And if you thought that downstream communities, always perfectly capitalized, whether they were downstream or not, you'd expect actually that downstream counties would be, seeing more of the damages would have actually larger percent poverty. So I think in this case, what we're showing is that it's driven by an empirical distribution of plants and people. And in another setting for another pollutant or another industry being regulated, it's unclear whether that distribution would hold or not.
Just so we're all on the same page with how the AP3 model is calculating the benefits and the costs of NOx, are they looking at NOx as a primary pollutant and ozone as a secondary pollutant? And that's why that dispersal is important, because of the secondary pollutant ozone formation? Yeah,
I believe that's how it works. So I'm not the expert in the mapping of NOx to ozone, but that's my understanding.
With the recognition that where NOx doesn't turn into ozone right away, it travels, it's photochemically changed, and that's where you end up with ozone. So in some ways, your results are pretty, from an atmospheric chemistry perspective, what you would expect, right? You release NOx here, you get ozone there. And I know that there have been some criticisms from colleagues on, even regulating ozone and controlling NOx has in its very nature kind of an environmental justice problem, because the communities that are sometimes most exposed to PM or other pollutants, aren't the ones most affected by ozone. That can be more industrial kind of conurbation communities.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good point. Getting back to the results that are mixed is so because the local demographics are in this case different than the demographics of the respective communities. If there are other local pollutants that don't travel as far, or just any other local externalities of the power plant, even visually, or other pollutants that we're not measuring here, that would again sort of complicate the story of how these regulations impact which communities.
Because I think it was slide number 15 when you were showing that one power plant in Orange County, and then it basically affects the whole eastern United States. This is a huge impact of one power plant when we're thinking about who's affected and how. So it's not as if it's just affecting the 3 neighboring counties. It's really half of the counties in the lower 48. So, how, from your perspective then, does your work inform policy design, pollution, and equity considerations going forward?
I think the key, I guess one key recommendation is for any policy, to think about how it's going to impact the environmental justice impacts of the policy is really a question of where people and plants are located, and do we expect those locations to change over time? So that would be like a key sort of like check to understand the impacts of any regulation on EJ effects. So for example, and I think for power plants or for the industries that you're regulating, a question would be, where are they located? What is the lifetime of these power plants? How much have we seen a change in the distribution of power plants over time from, economic or other conditions. And that kind of helps us understand whether we expected, dramatic changes in the spatial distribution of pollution sources, and then understanding where communities are located vis-a-vis those power plants. And of course, the hard part about that question is thinking about mobility, because of course, people can change locations. But I think there is some, broad sense of a spatial distribution of people and plants that we can do to think about some predictions around how a regulation would impact disproportionate pollution exposures.
And Aaron just wrote in the chat that AP3 is just PM. It's AP2 that also has ozone. So my bad for not working in
this. Okay.
So that's a good, but thank you, Aaron, for that clarification. And I want to leave you with a few minutes to kind of let us know where you're going, where you see the big questions in the field emerging, just so we can all kind of know what to watch in your work as it develops over the next years.
I think, I guess a key question for me is this question of spatial location among people and firms. And I think that's really where I'm headed, is to think about how power plants make location decisions, and how, there's a whole field of urban economics that thinks about how people choose where they want to live, which I'm increasingly curious about. But I think bringing in some of those methods and some of those studies to understand how people choose where to live and how the local environment impacts those decisions. And then in particular, how a change in local environment would impact those decisions. So, if we have specific policies that are going to clean up certain areas, we want to understand how that's going to impact the experienced amenity of the people that live in those areas, and whether those people are going to stay, or whether, those impacts are going to be capitalized in housing markets or other, causing sort of a reshuffling of people. So, I think that's really what I'm interested in, what I think is a key sort of missing piece of the puzzle, and understanding mechanisms that lead regulations to have different impacts, different EJ impacts. And so hopefully in the next, who knows, 5-10 years, that's an area where I can make a dent, thinking about how people and firms decide where to locate.
Great. Thank you so much for coming and being part of this series. It was just great to see your research and learn more about what you're doing. We have a slide on upcoming events that Stephanie can share now. And thanks, Stephanie, for all of your great logistics and organization. So our theme this term has been buildings and energy. We're moving into our new building in January, and making it happen, tools to accelerate carbon-free building. Will be a panel with public commissioner from California, with our dean from the Thayer School of Engineering, and some others. And we're really looking forward to that talk. Our next new energy series will be Liz Allen from Northeastern University, Opportunities and Risks for Resilience, Sustainability, and Equity. So this term of equity, and really building up this conversation, has been something that we've been very happy to be part of over these last months. And Paige, I want to thank you for your contribution in this conversation. It's just been wonderful to have you here today. And for everybody, thank you very much. Have a wonderful Wednesday wherever you are, whether it's morning, afternoon, or you're going to bed now. We sure appreciate your being part of this series. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.